The neon glow of Harlem was as hypnotic as it was unforgiving, its streets echoing the sound of footsteps that belonged to men chasing something far more dangerous than money, men like Frank Lucas. In the heart of this darkened world, a secret empire was being built, one that would span continents and change the way drugs were trafficked forever. But at that moment, none of this was visible to the outside world. To the casual observer, Harlem was just another city block in the grand canvas of New York, alive with music, hustle, and the hum of life in its rawest form. But lurking beneath this surface, beyond the music that reverberated from every corner, lay a hidden war. The kind of war that could never be seen on the front page of a newspaper. And at the center of it all was Frank Lucas. His story isn't just the tale of a drug lord, it's the story of how one man changed the rules of an empire built on silence, violence, and secrets. It's the story of how heroin, that deadly product, became a currency that ran through the veins of the city, like blood through a living body. Frank Lucas didn't just deal in drugs, he dealt in trust and deception, in loyalty and betrayal. His rise wasn't just about power, it was about control over something far bigger than what anyone could have imagined. At the time, Harlem was known as the epicenter of black culture in New York. Its streets were lined with towering brownstones, and the air was thick with the sounds of jazz, soul, and the hum of an unspoken understanding between the people who lived there. But even the soul of Harlem had its darker corners, places where the music faded, and shadows grew long. Frank Lucas wasn't born into wealth or power. In fact, his beginnings were anything but glamorous. Raised in poverty, far from the bright lights of Harlem, Frank came from a small town in North Carolina, where the best he could hope for was a life spent working the land or making ends meet in one of the many factories that dotted the southern landscape. But ambition has a way of carving new paths, and Frank Lucas was no different. It wasn't long before Frank's aspirations reached beyond his humble beginnings. Harlem called to him with promises of riches and power, a siren song that no one could resist. He was drawn to the city's dark promise of success, a place where fortune and fear played a dangerous game in the back alleys and smoky rooms. But Harlem in the 1970s was far from a place for dreamers, it was a battleground for anyone who dared to enter the world of organized crime. And Frank was no exception. The moment Frank set foot in Harlem, it didn't take long for him to realize that the city's underworld was a treacherous maze. The competition was fierce, and the dangers were ever present. But Frank was a man with a vision. He didn't just want to survive in Harlem, he wanted to control it. He was smart, methodical, and patient. He learned the ropes of the drug trade the way a student learns to play a musical instrument, slowly, carefully, until he could move through its complexities with ease. But Frank didn't just want to be another player in the game, he wanted to change the game. His opportunity came when he crossed paths with a man named Nicky Barnes, who had already carved a path for himself in the heroin trade. Barnes was one of the most well-known figures in Harlem's criminal world, a man who controlled a vast portion of the heroin market. Frank saw in him both an obstacle and an opportunity. He knew that to truly make his mark, he would have to challenge the established powers. But unlike most who tried to take down men like Barnes, Frank wasn't impulsive. He was methodical, careful in the way he studied the game. And that patience would pay off in ways no one could have predicted. The first step was understanding the heroin trade from the ground up, and that meant getting closer to the source. Frank wasn't interested in buying from middlemen. He wanted to control the supply chain from the moment the drug was produced. He made a deal with a network of smugglers that would change the trajectory of his life. Frank Lucas wasn't just selling heroin, he was bringing it in from a place far removed from the streets of Harlem, the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia, an area notorious for producing the purest heroin in the world. But that's where the story takes a turn. The Vietnam War, a bloody conflict that had engulfed Southeast Asia for years, became the backdrop for Frank's rise. The war, which consumed so much attention from the American government, also created a gap in the law. American soldiers stationed in Vietnam were unknowingly participating in the drug trade, either as addicts or through the black market. The chaos of the war made it easy to smuggle drugs back into the United States. Frank saw this as his opportunity. He bypassed the traditional channels of drug smuggling, the ones that had been in place for years, and set up his own supply line. Through a network of soldiers, Frank was able to bring in heroin straight from the fields of Southeast Asia. This was a game changer. The heroin Frank imported was far purer than what was being sold in Harlem. His product was superior, and the cost was lower, making it accessible to a larger market. But Frank didn't just rely on the quality of his heroin to build his empire, he relied on an even more valuable commodity: secrecy. Frank was methodical about keeping his operation under the radar. Unlike others in the trade who flaunted their wealth, Frank worked quietly in the background, making sure his movements were as undetectable as the heroin he was moving. As his network grew, Frank's influence in Harlem deepened. He was no longer just another street-level dealer, he had become the man to know in the drug world. He had built an empire that stretched far beyond Harlem's borders, reaching into cities all over the United States. And the key to his success was simple: control. Frank didn't just control the drug trade, he controlled the people who worked for him. His employees, known as his country boys, were loyal to him in ways that went beyond fear. They trusted him, and that trust made Frank's operation one of the most successful in the world. But with power comes attention, and the more successful Frank became, the more enemies he made. The law was closing in on him, but so were the men he had once worked alongside. His rise was a sharp contrast to the world he had entered, a world where loyalties shifted with the wind and alliances were as fragile as paper. Frank Lucas, the man who had come from nothing, was now a kingpin in the world of organized crime. But as the years went by, his rise would meet an inevitable downfall, one that would test the very foundations of his empire and the trust he had built. The world Frank Lucas had created was about to unravel, and it was only a matter of time before the forces of law and betrayal caught up with him. But for now, in the quiet of Harlem's streets, his empire was still untouchable, a testament to his cunning, his ambition, and his drive to carve a name for himself in a world built on shadows. The story of Frank Lucas had only just begun. Frank Lucas was born into a world that seemed to promise nothing but hardship. In the small, dusty town of La Grange, North Carolina, where the sounds of a rural life echoed far away from the bright lights of big cities, Frank learned the harsh realities of poverty and survival from a young age. His family lived modestly in a small wooden house, struggling to make ends meet in a community where the land seemed to hold more power than any person could dream of. But even in the quiet hum of rural life, Frank could feel the pull of something bigger. The world outside the boundaries of La Grange whispered of possibilities, of lives lived with purpose, power, and wealth. It was a dream too big for the small town he called home, but Frank had always been a dreamer. And from a young age, he knew that his path would take him far from the cotton fields and dirt roads of North Carolina. The days in La Grange passed slowly, the horizon always looking the same, with rows of crops and the occasional distant hum of a tractor. Yet, within the walls of Frank's home, there was an undercurrent of something more, an understanding that life, no matter how hard, could always be better. His family's struggles, though painful, shaped the boy into someone who would never settle for mediocrity. His mother was a deeply religious woman, whose prayers echoed in the small home, but Frank felt a quiet defiance stirring within him. He couldn't understand why some people were born into wealth, while others, like his family, seemed condemned to scrape by. The burning question that stayed with him as he grew older was simple: why should it be this way? His answer came when he made his way to Harlem, a place where dreams, no matter how wild, could become reality. It wasn't the world he knew in La Grange, but that was precisely the reason it called to him. Harlem in the 1960s and 70s was both a vibrant cultural epicenter and a dangerous, fractured underworld. It was the very embodiment of the American dream, but with a twist, a place where the rules were bent and broken every day, where wealth could be gained as quickly as it could be lost, and where survival often meant stepping into the shadows. It was clear from the start that Frank wasn't a man who would be content to simply observe the world around him. His eyes, sharp and calculating, looked at Harlem as something to conquer. He didn't just see the rich culture and music, he saw opportunity, raw and untapped. He'd come to New York with nothing but the clothes on his back and an ambition that burned as fiercely as the city's lights. It wasn't long before Frank realized that the path to wealth in Harlem wasn't a straightforward one. The city was divided, with different factions fighting for control of the drug trade, and the bloodied streets told stories of power and betrayal. The world he had entered was dangerous, but for Frank, it was just another challenge, one that he was more than willing to face head-on. In those early days, Frank didn't have the luxury of time to waste. He knew he had to act fast, or he'd be just another face in a crowd of hustlers, dreaming big but never making it. His introduction to Harlem's underworld came when he crossed paths with a man named Nicky Barnes. Barnes was already an established figure in the drug game, a larger-than-life personality who commanded respect. He controlled the heroin trade in Harlem, and his empire seemed unshakable. To Frank, Barnes represented both a challenge and an opportunity. In the world of organized crime, alliances were just as important as ambition, and Frank knew that to gain a foothold, he needed to align himself with the right people. But Frank was no fool. He wasn't looking to simply join Barnes' operation, he had bigger plans. In the way that only someone with ambition as fierce as his could, Frank began to learn the trade from the ground up. He didn't just observe from the sidelines, he became involved in every aspect of the operation, from securing suppliers to managing street dealers. The more he learned, the more he saw the cracks in the system, and the more he realized that there was a smarter, more efficient way to run things. Frank Lucas wasn't content with mediocrity. He had no interest in being just another small-time dealer or a footnote in the stories of the Harlem underworld. He wanted to rise to the top. It wasn't long before Frank started thinking bigger. He began to take steps that no one else had the vision or the courage to take. While others in the drug trade were content to work with middlemen, Frank sought to control the entire supply chain. This was the beginning of what would become his greatest strength, his ability to think beyond the confines of Harlem, to see the global scope of the drug trade, and to make it work in his favor. The break in Frank's plan came when he found his entry point into the heroin market that would eventually propel him to the top. He knew that if he was going to succeed, he had to control the product itself. That's when Frank's world shifted from the gritty streets of Harlem to the war-torn jungles of Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War, a brutal and chaotic conflict that was consuming the American military and government, was the key to Frank's success. The war presented a unique opportunity to smuggle heroin into the United States without attracting too much attention. The chaos of the war made it easy for drugs to flow back into the country undetected, and Frank saw this as his chance to create a direct pipeline to the purest heroin in the world. The Golden Triangle, a region in Southeast Asia where Thailand, Laos, and Burma met, was notorious for producing the most potent heroin. Frank's smuggling operation would bypass the traditional routes, cutting out the middlemen who had been running the drug trade for years. Instead, he relied on a network of soldiers, men who were often involved in the war, to smuggle heroin back to the U.S., under the radar. Frank knew that in this chaotic landscape, where lives were constantly being upended, he had an advantage. The Vietnam War wasn't just a backdrop, it was the perfect cover for his operation. With the heroin flowing in, Frank set up a sophisticated distribution system in the United States, focusing primarily on Harlem, where he could keep a tight grip on the market. His product was pure and cheap, and it quickly became the go-to heroin for dealers across the country. The success of his operation was almost immediate, and it wasn't long before Frank Lucas had made a name for himself as the man who controlled Harlem's heroin trade. But Frank's ascent wasn't just about his business savvy. It was about something deeper, something more intangible. It was about loyalty, trust, and the unspoken rules of the streets. Frank had a unique ability to inspire loyalty among his men, a loyalty that ran deeper than fear. His crew, which he affectionately referred to as his country boys, were hand-picked for their trustworthiness and work ethic. They weren't just street dealers, they were part of Frank's inner circle, his family in the most literal sense of the word. The bond between Frank and his men was what made his operation so successful. They weren't just employees, they were partners in his empire. As Frank's power grew, so did his reputation. He wasn't just another drug dealer, he was a businessman, a man who understood how to turn a profit while keeping his operation hidden from the law. His quiet, unassuming demeanor made it easy for him to slip under the radar, and he used this to his advantage. In a world where violence and flashy displays of wealth were common, Frank Lucas operated with a quiet, calculating presence that made him stand out. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but his silence spoke volumes. As Frank settled into his new life, Harlem itself became his canvas. The streets, once filled with chaos, began to fall under his control. The men who had once ruled the neighborhoods with intimidation and fear were now being replaced by Frank's country boys, who operated with precision and loyalty. The city that had once felt like a battleground was slowly becoming Frank's empire, a kingdom built on trust, power, and a product that could not be ignored. And yet, even as Frank's power grew, the shadows of the world he inhabited continued to loom large, threatening to pull him back into the darkness he had escaped. But for now, Frank Lucas was a king in his own right, and Harlem was his kingdom. Frank Lucas was no stranger to the harshness of life. In the criminal world, survival was often a matter of sharp instincts, calculated moves, and relentless ambition. From the moment he set foot in Harlem, he knew he was entering a realm where the line between friend and foe was razor-thin, where trust was a commodity more valuable than gold, and where betrayal could come from the most unlikely of sources. The streets of Harlem were alive with tension, each corner holding a secret, each alley a story of survival, greed, and power. But for Frank, this wasn't just another street corner. This was the place where his dreams of wealth and power would be realized. But the road to the top was neither easy nor straightforward, and it didn't take long for him to realize that climbing the ladder of success in Harlem's underworld would require more than just ambition. In the beginning, Frank's first step into the world of organized crime was a quiet one. He wasn't some brash, overconfident young man, he understood that the city's criminal landscape was already controlled by well-established figures. It was here that Frank learned one of his most valuable lessons, the importance of patience. He knew that he couldn't just come in and challenge the powerhouses like Nicky Barnes without first understanding the intricacies of the game. The drug trade, he quickly learned, was a world of complex relationships, delicate negotiations, and delicate egos. To survive, you had to be not just smart, but strategic. So, Frank bided his time. He took smaller jobs, ran errands for the established players, and slowly began to build relationships with the key figures in Harlem's drug scene. At first, it seemed as if he was just another low-level street hustler, blending into the background, doing the dirty work for those in power. But Frank had a purpose behind every action. He was observing, learning, and most importantly, earning the trust of the people who would eventually make him a player in their world. But it wasn't just about working your way up the ranks. In the cutthroat world of Harlem's drug trade, there was something much more dangerous at play: betrayal. It was an unspoken rule that in this business, the more you trusted someone, the more vulnerable you became. For Frank, this reality became painfully clear when he made a fateful decision to work alongside Nicky Barnes, a man whose influence in Harlem's drug trade was unmatched. Barnes, a larger-than-life figure who commanded both respect and fear, was someone Frank saw as both a mentor and a competitor. Frank admired his drive, his ability to control the streets of Harlem with an iron fist, and his capacity to strike deals with anyone who had something to offer. Barnes was at the top of the food chain, and Frank knew that if he wanted to make his mark, he had to understand how Barnes maintained his dominance. But as much as Frank studied Barnes' operations, he also saw weaknesses, imperfections in the system that Barnes had built over the years. One of the first cracks Frank noticed was Barnes' reliance on middlemen. These intermediaries were responsible for moving the heroin into the country, which meant they were also responsible for taking a cut of the profits. Frank, being the calculating businessman he was, recognized that eliminating these middlemen would streamline the entire operation, lowering costs, and increasing profits. To Frank, this wasn't just an opportunity, it was the key to his future. The real turning point in Frank's journey came when he began to understand just how much power he could amass by cutting out the middlemen. He knew that to take control of the heroin trade in Harlem, he had to gain direct access to the heroin itself, not just the streets. So, Frank began to make moves that would change the entire structure of the drug trade, not just in Harlem, but across the nation. He reached out to suppliers who were far beyond the reach of Barnes and other players. The Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia, a region notorious for its heroin production, became Frank's gateway to the top. But securing this supply chain wasn't going to be easy, especially considering that the area was embroiled in the chaos of the Vietnam War. Frank understood that the war created an opportunity, an opening in the system that could be exploited. The conflict had already devastated the region, and the American military presence in Southeast Asia was at an all-time high. Soldiers, many of whom were deeply involved in the drug trade, provided the perfect cover for Frank's operation. As the war raged on, Frank saw his chance to bypass the traditional drug smuggling routes that had been in place for decades. He forged connections with soldiers who were willing to smuggle heroin back to the United States, taking advantage of the chaos and confusion that defined the war. The logistics of smuggling heroin through a war zone were, of course, not without their challenges. But Frank, ever the strategist, was meticulous in how he set up his operation. He understood that the success of his business depended on his ability to stay under the radar. His heroin would be far purer than anything else on the streets, and its price would be far lower. Frank's operation was so well organized that it was nearly impossible to detect. His ability to stay hidden in plain sight, while moving massive amounts of heroin, became one of his trademarks. As the heroin began to flow into the United States, Frank's reputation grew. He was no longer just a player in Harlem's underworld, he was becoming a force to be reckoned with. His operations spread quickly throughout the country, and soon, even other criminal organizations were forced to acknowledge his dominance. He had built an empire without anyone really noticing. Frank's operation was quiet, efficient, and deadly, and his ability to stay under the radar made him nearly invincible. He had achieved what many others had failed to do, he controlled the heroin trade without ever making a public spectacle of himself. He didn't need flashy displays of wealth or violent outbursts. He let his product speak for itself. But as Frank's empire grew, so did the risks. The larger the operation, the more enemies he made, and the more vulnerable he became. In a world where alliances shifted like the wind and loyalty could disappear in an instant, Frank knew that his position at the top was precarious. The more successful he became, the more people wanted to take him down. But Frank wasn't naive. He understood the risks of the game, and he had a plan for dealing with them. One of the keys to Frank's success was his ability to surround himself with loyal men, his country boys, as he liked to call them. These were the men who would do anything for him, men who had come from rural backgrounds much like Frank himself. They were trustworthy, hard-working, and dedicated to making the operation run smoothly. Frank trusted them implicitly, and in return, they trusted him. Their loyalty was one of the cornerstones of his empire. But Frank also knew that loyalty, while valuable, could be a double-edged sword. When things went wrong, it wasn't just his business that was on the line, it was his life. In the midst of all this power and success, Frank was beginning to feel the weight of the empire he had built. The shadows that had once seemed so far away were now encroaching on his life. The law, once distant and ineffective, was starting to close in on him. And with every passing day, Frank's once silent empire became harder to maintain. The more successful he became, the more visible he became. He had built something that was nearly untouchable, but even the strongest empires are eventually brought down by those who seek to destroy them. And as Frank's enemies began to move in closer, he realized that no matter how carefully he had built his empire, it could be torn apart in an instant. For all the success and power Frank had amassed, it was clear that the game was far from over. The stakes were higher than ever, and the risks were greater than he could have imagined. But for Frank Lucas, the thrill of the chase, the drive to be more than just another face in the crowd, was what had brought him to this point. And no matter how dangerous the game became, he couldn't stop playing. Because in the world he had chosen, there was only one rule: never stopped climbing, no matter what the cost. The transformation of Frank Lucas from a relatively unknown figure to one of the most feared and respected men in Harlem's drug trade was not an accident. It was a carefully planned, deliberate ascent, each move executed with precision, a chess game where every decision mattered. Harlem, with its bustling streets, glowing lights, and the hum of 1,000 dreams, was the perfect backdrop for Frank's rise. But behind the glimmer of the city's energy, the truth was harsher. Harlem was a war zone, a place where only the strongest survived. It wasn't enough to be ambitious. Frank had to be smart, calculating, and above all, he had to be ruthless. It wasn't just the heroin trade that Frank mastered, it was the business of fear, loyalty, and power. Harlem's streets were not filled with kings but with men who ruled through intimidation and violence. Frank understood that in order to control Harlem, he needed more than just a steady supply of heroin, he needed to control the very men who would distribute it. His ambition extended beyond the drug market. Frank didn't just want to be the biggest drug dealer in Harlem. He wanted to be the only one. He wanted to ensure that anyone who sought to rival him was swiftly silenced, either through intimidation or more permanent means. The first step was establishing control over his territory. While the other drug dealers in Harlem fought for control of various corners, alleyways, and street blocks, Frank took a more strategic approach. He knew that by maintaining a steady and reliable supply of pure heroin, he could undercut his competitors. The purity of the drug was his greatest advantage. It wasn't just that he had access to cheaper heroin, his product was of a quality that could not be matched. It was the kind of heroin that could be sold at a lower price but still make a substantial profit. Those who tried to sell inferior products were soon pushed out of the market, unable to compete with Frank's high-quality supply. This was the beginning of Frank Lucas's domination. His heroin flooded the streets of Harlem, and before long, other dealers were scrambling to keep up. Frank's operation was meticulous. He was not just a street-level dealer, he was a businessman. He understood the importance of logistics, of distribution, and of maintaining a low profile while still controlling the flow of drugs through one of the most dangerous cities in America. Unlike others who flaunted their wealth with flashy cars, expensive clothes, and lavish parties, Frank operated under the radar. He made sure his name was never tied to the crimes he committed. In the world of organized crime, staying invisible was often more valuable than any display of power. Frank's silence was his strength. But despite his quiet nature, Frank was no stranger to the occasional violent outburst. He knew that to maintain his position, he would have to send a message to anyone who dared to cross him. Harlem was full of men who had earned their power through bloodshed, and Frank wasn't afraid to use the same methods to protect what he had built. However, even in his moments of violence, Frank maintained a calm, measured demeanor. He was never impulsive. His actions were calculated, designed to send a message while keeping his hands clean. It was this balance of power and restraint that set Frank apart from the other figures in Harlem's underworld. The true extent of Frank's influence became apparent when he began to recruit his country boys. These were men who had come from rural backgrounds, much like Frank himself, and were eager to escape the poverty of the South for the promise of wealth in Harlem. Frank saw them not just as workers, but as family. He trusted them implicitly, and they, in turn, trusted him with their lives. Frank's tight-knit group of loyal men became the backbone of his empire. They were the ones who moved his product, protected his interests, and ensured that his operation ran smoothly. In return, Frank provided them with the opportunity to earn a living and the protection of a man who was feared throughout the city. The loyalty Frank fostered among his men was unmatched. It was a loyalty built on trust, but also on necessity. In Harlem, the drug trade was a dangerous business, and survival often depended on who you trusted and who you were willing to betray. Frank's men knew that in working for him, they were safe. But Frank also made it clear that betrayal had a price. Anyone who crossed him was dealt with swiftly and without mercy. This ruthless approach helped to solidify Frank's position at the top. It was not enough for him to just control the heroin trade, he had to control the entire environment that surrounded it. He was a master at creating an atmosphere of fear and respect. One of the most significant aspects of Frank's rise to power was his ability to build alliances. Unlike the lone wolves who relied solely on force to maintain control, Frank understood the importance of collaboration. He forged partnerships with other crime figures and even maintained a relationship with the police, a tactic that would prove crucial as his empire expanded. Frank's ability to keep his operation running smoothly, while simultaneously ensuring that he was never directly linked to any of the crimes committed, made him nearly untouchable. But as Frank's influence grew, so did the pressure. The more successful he became, the more people wanted a piece of his empire, and not all of them were willing to play by the same rules. As the money flowed in, Frank began to face more challenges from both within and outside his organization. Rival drug lords, law enforcement, and even the very men who had helped him rise to the top began to see Frank as a threat. Harlem, which had once felt like his kingdom, began to feel smaller. The shadows of his empire were closing in, and Frank could sense that his reign was starting to be challenged. Despite the growing tension, Frank remained unshaken. He had come this far by being careful, by staying under the radar and by never letting his guard down. But he also knew that the longer he stayed at the top, the greater the risk of exposure. The world of organized crime is built on fleeting moments of success, followed by inevitable falls from grace. Frank was not naive enough to believe that his empire would last forever. The key, as he saw it, was to enjoy the fruits of his labor while he could, and to always be one step ahead of those who sought to destroy him. Yet even as the pressure mounted, Frank continued to build. His operation was thriving, and his network of contacts stretched far beyond Harlem. Frank was no longer just a drug dealer, he was a businessman on a global scale. His heroin was being distributed not just in New York, but in cities across the United States. He had become the most powerful man in Harlem, and his empire was only growing. The money he was making was astronomical, and with each passing day, Frank's power seemed to expand exponentially. But with that power came more risks. The more territory Frank controlled, the more enemies he made. And in a city as dangerous as Harlem, enemies were never far behind. Frank understood that his success was as much about survival as it was about ambition. Every move he made, every decision he took, had the potential to push him closer to the edge of his empire's collapse. But that was the nature of the game. In the end, it was all about staying ahead of the pack, keeping your enemies guessing, and never letting your guard down. Frank Lucas wasn't just building a criminal empire, he was building a legacy. A legacy that would be defined not by the wealth he amassed or the fear he instilled, but by the quiet, unrelenting drive that had taken him from the poverty of North Carolina to the heights of power in Harlem's underworld. The rise of Frank Lucas was more than a story of success in the drug trade. It was the story of a man who had defied the odds and built an empire from nothing. And while his reign in Harlem would not last forever, his name would live on, whispered in the streets long after his downfall. As Frank Lucas' empire continued to expand, so did his reputation. From the outside, it seemed like nothing could shake the grip he had on Harlem streets. His rise from humble beginnings to being one of the most feared men in the country was a testament to his skill, patience, and ambition. His heroin flooded the streets of New York, and the city buzzed with rumors about the elusive drug kingpin who had built his empire without ever stepping into the spotlight. But as powerful as Frank had become, he knew the price of success in the underworld. The bigger you get, the harder it is to stay invisible. At first, Frank had operated from the shadows. His role in the heroin trade was known only to a select few, those who worked for him and those who were involved in the highest echelons of the business. To the outside world, Frank was just another name in the criminal underworld, his power and influence unseen, his presence felt only in the supply chains that kept the streets of Harlem and beyond well stocked with heroin. He was known as a man who never called attention to himself, preferring to work quietly and efficiently. His empire wasn't built on loud displays of wealth or violence. Instead, it was built on his ability to remain out of sight, to keep his name out of the mouths of those who might try to take him down. But as time went on, Frank's quiet success began to attract unwanted attention. In the world of organized crime, even the most careful and cautious men couldn't remain invisible forever. The more Frank's empire grew, the more enemies he made. And in a city like New York, where rivalries between crime families were as common as the subway trains running under the streets, enemies were never far behind. His heroin was too pure, too cheap, and too widely distributed for people not to take notice. Frank's rise to power wasn't just impressive, it was undeniable. His product had the streets buzzing, but so did the rumors that swirled around his mysterious operation. People wanted to know who Frank Lucas was and how he had managed to stay under the radar for so long. The law, of course, was another entity that had started to take notice of Frank. In the early days of his operation, law enforcement had been more concerned with the larger drug cartels and their operations. The sheer scope of Frank's operation had made it difficult for authorities to pin him down. But as the years went by and his influence grew, so did the pressure to bring him down. The police were beginning to realize that Frank was no ordinary dealer. He wasn't just a street-level drug pusher trying to make a quick buck. He was running an empire that spanned the entire country, and his operation was becoming more sophisticated with each passing year. But what made Frank particularly difficult to catch was his ability to keep his hands clean. He had surrounded himself with loyal men who did the dirty work, while he remained behind the scenes, orchestrating the entire operation with a level of control that few had ever seen before. Frank was a ghost in the system, untouchable, elusive, and always one step ahead. But Frank Lucas' empire wasn't built on just secrecy and fear, it was also built on trust. The men who worked for him were more than just employees, they were his family. The loyalty he commanded among his country boys, the men he had brought in from the rural South, was unmatched. These men were fiercely devoted to him, and in return, Frank treated them as equals, ensuring their safety and wealth in a world where both were fleeting commodities. His leadership was based on respect, not just fear. Frank's men trusted him, and he trusted them. This bond allowed him to build an empire that was, in many ways, untouchable. It was a loyalty that went beyond mere business. These men would lay down their lives for Frank if it came to that. And in a world as dangerous as the one Frank inhabited, this kind of loyalty was as valuable as gold. However, even in this tight-knit circle, betrayal was always a threat. Frank understood this more than anyone. He had seen firsthand how quickly loyalty could turn into treachery in the criminal underworld. One of the most dangerous aspects of running an empire was the constant fear that someone, somewhere, might decide to sell you out. Frank was a man who trusted his instincts, and his ability to sense betrayal was one of the key factors in his success. But even he couldn't predict when someone would turn on him. It was during the height of his power that Frank's world began to unravel. The first crack in his empire appeared when one of his closest allies, a man who had been with him since the early days, betrayed him. Frank had always been cautious about who he trusted, but even his keen judgment couldn't prevent the betrayal that would set off a chain of events that would eventually lead to his downfall. The man who had once been one of Frank's most trusted lieutenants had begun to talk. He had been arrested on unrelated charges, and under the pressure of the law, he had cracked. He began to give information to the police about Frank's operation, the very operation that Frank had spent years building in silence. This betrayal set the stage for what would soon become a high-stakes game of cat and mouse between Frank Lucas and law enforcement. As the law closed in on him, Frank's world began to feel smaller. The men he had trusted began to question their own loyalty, and the once solid foundation of his empire began to shake. He had always been a man who operated in the shadows, never drawing attention to himself. But now, his every move was being watched. The pressure of running such a massive operation was beginning to take its toll. The game that Frank had played so well for so many years was becoming more dangerous with each passing day, and the stakes were higher than ever. But Frank Lucas was no ordinary criminal. He had been through enough in his life to know how to survive. The very qualities that had made him successful, the ability to stay calm under pressure, to think several steps ahead, and to trust his instincts, became his greatest assets in the face of mounting pressure. As the noose tightened around him, Frank was determined not to go down without a fight. He knew that if he were to survive, he would need to outthink the system, just as he had done with his drug operation. He wasn't going to let the law or betrayal destroy the empire he had built. Frank had come too far, and he wasn't about to let it all slip away. The tension continued to build as Frank's operation was slowly exposed. The streets of Harlem, once filled with whispers of his success, were now filled with the sound of police sirens and the frantic movement of law enforcement. Frank had become a target, but he wasn't ready to fall just yet. He knew that the law would eventually catch up with him, but he also knew that he could not be caught without a fight. Frank's entire life had been a series of calculated risks, and this was just one more chapter in his relentless rise to power. And so, as the noose tightened around him and the walls began to close in, Frank Lucas realized that he was about to enter the most dangerous game of his life. The stakes had never been higher, and the world he had spent so many years building was on the verge of collapse. But Frank was no stranger to danger. He had survived the streets of Harlem, outsmarted the law, and built an empire from nothing. And now, as the shadows of betrayal and law enforcement closed in, Frank knew that his empire was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. His rise to power had been swift, but his fall, if it came, would be just as dramatic. The question now was, how would it end? The walls of Frank Lucas' empire had been closing in for some time now. His operation, once thriving on secrecy, had started to unravel as law enforcement tightened its grip on Harlem and the surrounding streets. For years, Frank had built a reputation for being untouchable, a man who was as much a myth as a reality. His heroin was everywhere, but his name was barely ever spoken aloud. It was the perfect storm of success. He controlled the flow of drugs across the country, yet managed to keep his personal life well hidden behind layers of loyalty, silence, and calculated decisions. But even the most well-planned empires are susceptible to the slow erosion of time. For Frank Lucas, the storm was no longer a distant threat, it was already at his doorstep. The crack in the dam came when Frank's most trusted associate turned on him. It was a betrayal so deep that it threatened to bring everything Frank had built crashing down. The man, a close confidant who had worked by Frank's side for years, had been arrested. Under the pressure of interrogation, he folded, revealing Frank's name, the routes used for smuggling, and details of the entire operation. The damage was done, and Frank was suddenly the most wanted man in the city. His name, once whispered only in fear, was now being shouted by law enforcement officials, criminal associates, and even the press. Frank had been careful for so long, but now, the game had changed. The betrayal didn't just come from within his ranks, it came from the very system Frank had spent years working around. In the world of organized crime, the idea of turning in someone who had built an empire from the ground up was not just about personal gain, it was about survival. Frank's success, which had once made him untouchable, now made him the target of every law enforcement agency that had been chasing ghosts for decades. The net had been cast wide, and Frank was at the center of it. At the same time, his rivals in Harlem, who had been kept in check by Frank's silent dominance, saw the unfolding events as their opportunity. Men who had once feared him were now emboldened. As Frank's attention shifted to dealing with the encroaching law enforcement pressure, the cracks in his operation began to grow wider. It was no longer just the threat of the police that loomed over him, but the potential collapse of his entire network. One by one, his former allies began to waver. Deals that had once seemed ironclad were now riddled with doubt and distrust. In the underworld, loyalty was a currency, but even the most loyal men can be tempted by the prospect of money or safety, especially when their lives are on the line. The quiet tension of the past years had escalated into full-blown paranoia. Frank knew that the law had him in its sights, and he knew that if he was going to survive this, he had to act swiftly and decisively. His network of contacts, which had once been his greatest asset, was now a double-edged sword. The pressure was mounting, and Frank had to make a choice: trust the men who had been with him for so long, or make the ultimate sacrifice and walk away from it all before it all came crashing down. But walking away was never an option for Frank. He had built this empire from the ground up, and he wasn't going to let it crumble just because the law had gotten close. The law, after all, was always going to catch up with him. It was the way of the world he inhabited. But there was something Frank had that no one else in the game had, the will to outlast everyone. While others in the drug trade were consumed by greed, violence, and the desire to expand their empires, Frank had always been a man of patience. He understood the game better than anyone, how to wait, how to build, and how to strike when the time was right. And now, as the walls closed in, it was time for Frank to strike back. But Frank's calculated patience was not enough to protect him from the increasing pressure. His downfall, like the rise of his empire, was not dramatic or explosive, it was a slow burn, a process of gradual exposure. Each day that passed brought with it a new challenge, a new piece of information that brought Frank one step closer to being taken down. The police were closing in, but they weren't the only ones after him. Rival gangs, once subdued by Frank's quiet strength, saw the weakness in his empire. They pounced on the opportunity to take control of the market Frank had built. Frank, ever the strategist, had anticipated such a move, but the shifting tides of the underworld were unpredictable. One slip, one mistake, and everything could come crashing down. As law enforcement began to connect the dots, the net around Frank tightened further. His associates, once loyal to the core, were now questioning everything. The thought of their own safety overshadowed their commitment to the cause. Even those who had worked closest with Frank began to pull away, fearing for their lives as the pressure mounted. For Frank, this was the most dangerous part of the game. The fear of betrayal was always in the air, but now it had become a tangible threat. In an empire built on trust, the loss of that trust was the first step toward collapse. Yet, Frank wasn't one to crumble easily. He still had the strength of his loyal men, the ones who had been with him from the beginning, the country boys, who had come to Harlem with nothing but a dream. They had grown with Frank, learned the ins and outs of the game, and built a bond of loyalty that few could understand. Frank trusted them, and they trusted him. It was this bond that kept him going, even when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. But as the days wore on, Frank began to see that even loyalty had its limits. As much as he had taught his men to trust him, the reality of their situation had begun to set in. The law was closing in, and the streets were no longer a safe haven. Every move Frank made was being watched. He could feel the eyes of the law and his rivals on him, and he knew that sooner or later, his empire would come to an end. The question was no longer if, but when. In the final months before his downfall, Frank became a man of action. His once quiet, calculated nature gave way to a more frantic urgency. He knew the end was coming, and he had to act fast if he was going to escape with his life. The plan was simple: disappear. But even as he formulated his escape, Frank knew that there was no real way to outrun the consequences of his actions. He had built an empire on a foundation of secrecy, loyalty, and fear, but that foundation was now crumbling. The law had him in their sights, and no amount of planning could stop it. In a final attempt to maintain control over his empire, Frank made a desperate move to sever his ties with anyone who might be vulnerable to law enforcement. He began to cut off ties with key players in his network, slowly pulling the strings of his empire one by one. But it was clear that Frank's empire was no longer sustainable. The end was inevitable. His name was now everywhere, and his past, once so carefully hidden, was being uncovered piece by piece. The empire that had once been untouchable was now just another story of rise and fall in the violent underworld of organized crime. Frank Lucas, the man who had built an empire from the ground up, was now the hunted. The shadows that had once served as his sanctuary were now closing in on him, and Frank realized that there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. But even as the end drew near, one thing remained clear: Frank Lucas had played the game on his own terms, and now, as the law and his rivals closed in, he knew that his name would be remembered. The legend of Frank Lucas, the quiet kingpin of Harlem, would live on, even if his empire was no more. As Frank Lucas' empire continued to crumble under the pressure of law enforcement and betrayal, the quiet confidence he once carried began to erode. For years, he had been the master of the streets, moving silently through the shadows, his name whispered only among those who needed to know. But now, the walls were closing in. The net was tightening around him. No matter how many times he had outsmarted the authorities in the past, this time felt different. The stakes were higher, and the risks, greater than ever. Every decision Frank made in these final days was under a microscope, his enemies watched his every move, and so did the law. In those final months, Frank's life became a whirlwind of frantic calculations and desperate measures. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm, to think several steps ahead, but now, even he couldn't escape the impending storm. His rivals, once too afraid to challenge him, were now emboldened by the cracks they saw in his armor. The powerful drug kingpin who had once controlled the flow of heroin across the country was now vulnerable, and they knew it. Harlem's underworld was shifting, and new players were eager to stake their claim. For Frank, this meant two things: first, the imminent collapse of his empire, and second, the dangerous game of survival that awaited him. But Frank wasn't one to go down without a fight. He had survived the streets of North Carolina, escaped the clutches of poverty, and built an empire in one of the toughest neighborhoods in America. If anyone could survive this, it was Frank Lucas. And so, as the pressure mounted, he made one of the most dangerous moves of his life: he decided to cooperate with the authorities. It was a decision that stunned many, as Frank had always prided himself on being a man of his word. His loyalty to his men, his family, and his empire had always been unwavering. But now, in the face of impending doom, Frank knew that survival was the only thing that mattered. If he was going to get out of this alive, he needed to play a different game. Cooperating with the authorities wasn't a decision Frank made lightly. He had built his empire on silence and secrecy, and now he was being asked to tear it all down. The very thought of turning on his own people, his men, the ones who had worked alongside him for years, seemed almost impossible. But the law was closing in, and Frank knew that if he didn't make a deal, he would end up behind bars for the rest of his life. His carefully constructed world was falling apart, and he needed to protect himself. The decision to cooperate was also a move that would forever change the perception of Frank Lucas in the eyes of the public. Once, he had been seen as a mysterious figure, a man who commanded respect through fear and silence. Now, he would become something else: a government witness, a man who had turned on his own to save himself. Frank knew that this would destroy his reputation, but in the end, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that he stayed alive. As the days passed and his cooperation with law enforcement became public, the underworld that had once revered him began to turn its back on him. There would be no loyalty left for Frank Lucas once the story came out. The man who had built his empire on trust and respect was now a pariah in the very world he had once ruled. But the law didn't just come for Frank. It came for his entire operation. The authorities had spent years chasing the ghost of Frank Lucas, and now, with his cooperation, they had the evidence they needed to dismantle his empire piece by piece. Frank's empire, once built on the steady flow of heroin, was now crumbling. The police seized his assets, arrested his associates, and began dismantling the operation that had made him one of the most powerful men in Harlem. Frank watched from the sidelines, powerless to stop the collapse of everything he had worked so hard to build. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks: he had spent his entire life creating something that, in the end, had been doomed to fail. The heroin trade was never a lasting empire. It was a ticking time bomb, always destined to implode under the weight of its own violence, secrecy, and betrayal. In the aftermath of his cooperation, Frank faced the consequences of his decisions. The life he had built was gone. His empire, once a well-oiled machine, was now in ruins. He had lost everything: his wealth, his status, his reputation, and most importantly, his freedom. Frank was no longer a feared kingpin of the streets, he was a man facing the full wrath of the law. The authorities had their eyes on him now, and his cooperation had made him a valuable tool in their fight against the drug trade. Frank had hoped that by cooperating, he could negotiate a lesser sentence, but even he knew that the damage had been done. The public saw him as a traitor, a man who had turned his back on everything he had once stood for. Yet, as much as Frank's life had changed, his past never fully left him. The ghosts of his empire continued to haunt him, and the betrayal he had experienced from his own men left deep scars. The life he had lived, the power he had once held, and the fear he had instilled in others were all gone. But what remained was the realization that Frank Lucas, in his quest for power and dominance, had ultimately built a house of cards. No matter how carefully he had constructed his empire, it had always been fragile. And now, it had come crashing down. The impact of Frank's fall from grace wasn't limited to his own life. The people who had worked for him, who had trusted him, now found themselves caught in the wake of his decisions. Many were arrested, some even convicted, and Frank found himself at the center of a legal storm that spread far beyond Harlem. The heroin trade, which had once been the foundation of his empire, was now under intense scrutiny, and law enforcement began to crack down on every dealer, every connection, every route that had been part of Frank's network. As Frank's empire fell apart, so too did the relationships he had spent years cultivating. He had been a man of loyalty, a man who had built his empire with the trust of others. But in the end, it was that very loyalty that proved to be his undoing. The very men who had once stood by him now felt the sting of betrayal, even though Frank had never directly betrayed them. His cooperation with the authorities meant that their lives, too, were now in jeopardy. Frank had chosen his survival over loyalty, and in doing so, he had become a man with no allies, no friends, and no protection. In the wake of his fall, Frank's name became synonymous with betrayal. The man who had once been the king of Harlem was now a cautionary tale, a symbol of what could happen when ambition, power, and betrayal collided. His story, once one of remarkable rise, was now one of inevitable fall. Frank Lucas had built an empire based on secrecy, power, and loyalty, but in the end, it was those very foundations that crumbled. His name would forever be etched in the annals of criminal history, but not as the feared kingpin he once was. Instead, he would be remembered as the man who lost everything. The man who had built his empire on the backs of others, only to have it all slip through his fingers. And in the end, the question remained, was it worth it? Would Frank Lucas, if given the chance, have done anything differently? Or had the pursuit of power and wealth ultimately been his undoing? As Frank Lucas sat behind bars, the world he had spent years building slowly began to dissipate. The quiet strength he had once commanded was now replaced with the stark reality of his downfall. For the first time in a long while, Frank was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. His rise to power had been swift, and his empire had been formidable. But the fall was equally rapid, as the very forces he had used to rise to the top were now being turned against him. The authorities had caught him, his allies were either in custody or scattered, and the empire he had created had been dismantled piece by piece. The life of luxury, the control, the fear, everything he had once taken for granted, was now slipping through his fingers. For Frank, prison was not just a physical space, it was a prison of his own making. His mind, which had once been sharp and strategic, was now clouded with regret and bitterness. As much as he had tried to maintain his calm composure during the investigation and trial, the truth was unavoidable. Frank Lucas had been brought down by his own decisions. The betrayal from within his ranks had set everything in motion, but it was his own decision to cooperate with the authorities that had sealed his fate. He had once been untouchable, a ghost in the criminal world, but now he was just another inmate in a system that had no place for men like him. The first few days in prison were a blur. Frank was used to the tough, unforgiving world of Harlem, but prison was a different beast altogether. In the streets of Harlem, Frank had been a king. He had moved through the city with an air of authority, his every step calculated and controlled. But in prison, he was just another convict, one among many. The rules were different here, and the power dynamics were far more complex. Frank had once been feared, but now he was just another face in the crowd. His name still carried weight, but it was a different kind of weight, a weight that brought unwanted attention rather than respect. In the prison system, Frank quickly realized that his reputation in the outside world didn't mean much. The respect he had once commanded had little value behind bars. He had to navigate the complex social structures of prison, where loyalty and trust were in short supply, and power was constantly shifting. Frank was used to being in control, but here, he was at the mercy of those around him. In some ways, this was the first time Frank had truly felt vulnerable. For all his intelligence, all his ambition, all the years he had spent building an empire, he was now just another man trying to survive in a world where power was fleeting and unpredictable. Despite the harsh reality of prison life, Frank wasn't one to simply accept his fate. His mind, still sharp despite the circumstances, began to work on ways to adapt to his new environment. Frank had spent his life outsmarting his enemies, and he wasn't about to stop now. In prison, survival was about more than just physical strength, it was about understanding the rules of the game and making the right moves at the right time. Frank had spent years navigating the world of organized crime, and he quickly realized that the prison system was just another game to be played. The first thing Frank did was assess the situation. He observed the inmates around him, noting their behavior, their alliances, and their weaknesses. He knew that in this environment, information was power. The more he knew about the people around him, the better positioned he would be to survive. Frank didn't have the luxury of time to waste. He had been brought to prison as a high-profile inmate, and this meant that he would constantly be under the microscope. The guards, the other inmates, the entire system, it was all watching him. But Frank wasn't afraid of being watched. He had learned long ago how to move through the world unnoticed, how to stay under the radar. And now, he applied those same lessons to his prison life. Frank quickly became a master at reading the room. He found allies where he could, people who could provide him with information and protection. He didn't trust anyone fully, but he knew how to play the game. He had learned early on that trust in the criminal world was a rare commodity, and that lesson held true in prison. Even the men who had once called him a friend could not be fully trusted. But Frank knew how to use people, how to leverage their loyalty to his advantage. He didn't need to trust them completely, he just needed to know enough to stay one step ahead. Over time, Frank began to gain a certain respect among the other inmates. His reputation from the outside world followed him, and while it didn't guarantee him power, it gave him a certain level of influence. People knew who he was, and many were curious about the man who had once ruled Harlem's drug trade. But Frank didn't flaunt his past. He didn't need to. His actions in prison spoke louder than any words ever could. He didn't try to assert himself as the alpha of the prison yard, instead, he used his knowledge, his connections, and his ability to stay calm under pressure to navigate the complex power dynamics of prison life. Yet, despite his ability to adapt, Frank was never truly at peace in prison. His thoughts were often consumed by what he had lost, the empire, the power, the respect. Frank had spent years building something that now seemed so far out of reach. The men who had once been his loyal lieutenants were either in prison or scattered, their fates uncertain. The heroin trade that had once been his life was now gone, replaced by the harsh reality of his new existence. Frank had spent so many years thinking that his empire was untouchable, but now he understood that nothing in this world lasts forever. The same qualities that had made him successful, the ambition, the patience, the intelligence, were now serving him in a completely different way. He wasn't trying to build an empire anymore. He was trying to survive. Despite his hardships, Frank never lost his sense of self. He may have been behind bars, but he still had the mind of a kingpin. He never forgot the lessons he had learned throughout his life, the importance of loyalty, the power of patience, and the need to stay one step ahead. Frank's time in prison was not just a punishment, it was a period of reflection, of understanding the true cost of his actions. The life he had lived, the empire he had built, had been fragile. It had been held together by loyalty, but loyalty could only take him so far. And now, as he sat in his prison cell, Frank understood that no matter how hard he tried, his empire had been built on a foundation that was bound to crack under pressure. Prison, for Frank, became a place of reckoning. He had once ruled an empire, but now he was just another man who had been broken by the system. Yet even in the midst of his downfall, Frank never gave up. He kept his mind sharp, he kept his plans tight, and he continued to navigate the prison system as he had once navigated the streets of Harlem. He knew that survival was about more than just physical strength, it was about maintaining control over your mind and your decisions. And Frank, despite everything, still had control. But the reality of his situation was undeniable. The world he had once ruled was gone. The men who had once feared him were now either behind bars or scattered in the wind. Frank's fall from grace was complete. The rise and fall of Frank Lucas, the kingpin of Harlem, was now a story told in whispers, a tale of ambition, power, and the inevitable consequences of living a life built on fear and secrecy. His legacy, once so firmly entrenched in the streets of Harlem, was now reduced to nothing more than a memory, a warning to those who might think they could build an empire on such fragile foundations. The fall of Frank Lucas from the heights of power to the grim reality of prison was not the end of his story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. His empire had crumbled, his allies scattered, and his name now carried a different weight. Once revered in the underworld, Frank was now a cautionary tale, a man whose rise and fall were marked by betrayal, ambition, and the inescapable truths of the criminal world. As Frank sat in his cell, the weight of his decisions bore down on him. In the quiet solitude of his prison existence, he could no longer hide from the consequences of his life. The legacy he had spent decades building, through his cunning, his patience, and his strategic alliances, had been shattered in the blink of an eye. Frank's mind was sharp as ever, still calculating, still analyzing. But now, the game had changed. He was no longer trying to outwit the authorities or rival gangs. He wasn't plotting his escape or searching for ways to reclaim his empire. Instead, he found himself reflecting on the choices that had brought him to this point. The road to power had been long and arduous, but it had been the choices Frank made along the way that ultimately led to his downfall. His obsession with building something that would stand the test of time had blinded him to the fragility of the world he inhabited. In the underworld, loyalty was often a currency, and it had been his loyalty to those closest to him that had ultimately betrayed him. His decision to cooperate with the authorities, in an effort to save himself, had irrevocably severed the ties that had once bound him to his men and his empire. The man who had once been untouchable, who had moved through Harlem streets like a shadow, was now just another prisoner, awaiting his fate. His name was no longer whispered in reverence or fear, it was a name that conjured images of betrayal, the one-time kingpin who had turned on his own. The law had gotten its victory, but it had come at a high cost. Frank had been a vital witness in many cases, but he wasn't the only one who had lost something. In the end, the drug trade that had made him so powerful had been completely dismantled. And for what? A sentence behind bars, the loss of everything he had worked so hard to build, and the knowledge that his name would forever be associated with treachery. Yet, in the stillness of his prison cell, Frank found a strange kind of peace. It wasn't the peace of a man who had come to terms with his actions, but rather the peace of someone who had been forced to face the harsh reality of their life. Frank Lucas had spent so much time building an empire that he had never truly considered what would happen if it all came crashing down. Now, he had nothing left but time, time to reflect, time to regret, and time to wonder if the pursuit of power had been worth it. His mind wandered back to the early days of his rise, those moments when the streets of Harlem had seemed endless, and the world had been at his fingertips. He had been a man on a mission, a man with a plan. Frank knew that the world of organized crime was a dangerous place, but he also understood that in such a world, danger was a necessary companion. He had learned to move in silence, to build alliances, and to strike when the time was right. But somewhere along the way, Frank had stopped playing the game for survival and started playing it for dominance. He had built an empire not just to survive, but to rule, to leave a legacy that would be remembered for generations. And in that pursuit, he had lost sight of the one thing that had made him successful in the first place, the ability to remain invisible, to stay out of the spotlight. Now, as Frank sat in his prison cell, he could only wonder what might have been different. He thought about the mistakes he had made, the moments when his pride, his ambition, and his desire for control had overridden his better judgment. It was easy to blame the betrayal, to blame the men who had turned on him. But Frank knew that he had made his own choices, and it was those choices that had ultimately led him here. It was those choices that had turned him from a man who had the world at his feet into a man whose life was now defined by the walls of a prison cell. But even in the face of such defeat, Frank didn't give up. He had never been one to quit, and he wasn't going to start now. The idea of being forgotten, of fading into obscurity, was something Frank could not abide. He knew that his story, for better or for worse, would be told for years to come. People would remember Frank Lucas. His name would be synonymous with the rise and fall of Harlem's drug empire, a symbol of the dangerous game that was played in the shadows. Frank may have lost everything, but his story would live on, a testament to the cost of ambition and the price of power. As the years passed, Frank's life behind bars became a reflection of the world he had once ruled. The same patterns that had shaped his criminal career now defined his existence in prison. He continued to keep to himself, maintaining the same strategic mindset that had gotten him to the top of the drug trade. But this time, the stakes were different. In prison, the consequences were not just financial or political, they were personal. Frank had to face the reality of his choices on a daily basis, and there was no escape from that. He couldn't outsmart the system this time. The law had already won, and Frank had already made his deal. Now, all he could do was ride out the consequences. Yet even as he sat in prison, Frank's story was far from over. In the years that followed, his name continued to resonate. The legacy of Frank Lucas became the stuff of legend, a man who had built an empire from the ground up, only to lose it all in the end. His story was told in documentaries, books, and even films. People were captivated by the rise of Frank Lucas, the quiet, calculating drug lord who had changed the face of the heroin trade in America. His life became a symbol of both ambition and failure, a story of a man who had dared to dream big, but had paid the ultimate price. But for Frank, the story wasn't about the glory or the fame, it was about the reality he had to face every day in prison. It was about the people he had betrayed, the men he had let down, and the legacy he had destroyed. His ambition had taken him to the top, but it had also led him to this dark place. And as he sat in his cell, Frank could not help but wonder if it had all been worth it. The power, the wealth, the fear, had it been worth the price he had paid? Frank Lucas had spent his life chasing the dream of a legacy, but in the end, it was a dream that had slipped through his fingers. His empire, once untouchable, was now a thing of the past. The power he had once wielded was now gone. But even in the depths of his fall, Frank understood that his story would continue to echo through the streets of Harlem and beyond. His name would be remembered, not as a cautionary tale, but as a symbol of a man who had dared to reach for the stars, only to fall back to earth with a crash that reverberated across the world of organized crime. And in that, Frank found some semblance of peace. He had built something, even if it had ultimately been destroyed. He had left his mark on the world, whether it was a good mark or a bad one didn't matter. What mattered was that he had been there, and his story would never be forgotten. Frank Lucas had long been a figure who commanded attention, not just for the empire he built but for the man he had become. Despite the monumental collapse of his criminal reign, the world he had left behind continued to reverberate with the echoes of his choices. What remained, after everything had been stripped away, after the luxury, the fear, and the respect, was a man who had been broken, not by external forces, but by his own ambition. Frank's journey was far from simple, and as the years passed, he became an enigma, both a cautionary tale and a living legend. The question remained, who was Frank Lucas, really? Was he a brilliant strategist who had built an empire, or was he just another man who had allowed his ambition to carry him too far? Prison life was a stark reminder of the consequences of Frank's choices. The confinement, the routine, and the sense of powerlessness were a far cry from the life he had once lived. But in many ways, Frank found solace in the simplicity of prison life. Gone were the pressures of managing an empire, the constant need to look over his shoulder, and the ever-present paranoia of betrayal. In prison, there was a sense of finality. There were no more decisions to make, no more games to play. Everything had been decided for him. And yet, even in the face of this new reality, Frank Lucas remained determined to leave his mark on the world in a different way. He wasn't finished, he wasn't ready to be forgotten. His story had already been immortalized, but Frank had always known that the truth was far more complicated than the versions people told. The public, who had once feared him, was now fascinated by his fall from grace. The rise of Frank Lucas had been meteoric. He had gone from a poor boy in North Carolina to the most powerful heroin dealer in Harlem. But it wasn't just his wealth and influence that captivated people, it was the way he did it. Frank had built his empire with precision and patience, never relying on brute force, but instead using silence and strategy to outmaneuver his enemies. In an industry where violence and ruthlessness were the norms, Frank had shown that it was possible to be powerful without being reckless. That was his legacy, the image of the silent, calculating kingpin who ruled Harlem with an almost ghost-like presence. But as time went on, the cracks in that image began to show. Frank Lucas had never been untouchable, no matter how much he had believed it. He had been fortunate, yes, but he had also made choices that eventually led to his downfall. The authorities, who had long been unable to catch him, finally closed in, not with force, but with the kind of quiet, methodical investigation that Frank himself had once employed. It was a slow process, a patient unraveling of a man who had become too comfortable, too confident in his power. In the end, the empire that Frank had so carefully constructed crumbled under the weight of his own decisions. And yet, even as his empire fell apart, Frank remained unbowed. He had lost everything, the money, the power, the connections, but he had not lost his will to survive. He had been forced to make choices that contradicted everything he had ever stood for, but that didn't make him any less formidable. Frank Lucas was not a man who gave up easily. He understood better than anyone that survival wasn't just about power, it was about adaptability. In prison, he would find a new way to survive, just as he had done when he first arrived in Harlem. The lessons he had learned in the streets were still valuable, even behind bars. Yet survival in prison wasn't just about playing the same game, it was about something else entirely. It was about coming to terms with the reality that he had been outplayed, that he had been brought down not by his rivals, but by his own choices. Frank had never considered that the very thing that made him so successful, his ability to manipulate and control, would one day be the thing that led to his undoing. The trust he had built with his men, the loyalty he had demanded, had all come crashing down when he made the decision to cooperate with the authorities. It was a move that cost him everything. In prison, Frank had to face the fact that he had sacrificed his integrity in exchange for his own survival. He had chosen to betray the world he had created in order to save himself. But even in the face of this harsh truth, Frank did not wallow in regret. He couldn't afford to. He was a man who had always known how to stay ahead of the game, and now he needed to do it again. In the prison system, Frank was not alone. He was surrounded by men who had their own stories, their own pasts, their own reasons for being there. Many of them had been part of the world Frank once inhabited, the criminal world, and many of them respected him, if not feared him. Frank was used to respect, but it was different now. In prison, respect was not given freely. It had to be earned all over again, and Frank knew that the best way to earn it was to stay silent, to observe, and to move only when it was absolutely necessary. In the outside world, Frank had been a kingpin, but in prison, he was just another inmate. His name might still carry weight, but it didn't matter much behind bars. What mattered now was survival, and Frank was determined to survive. Over time, Frank began to realize that the life he had lived, the empire he had built, was never truly his. He had been a player in a much larger game, one that he had been too blind to see until it was too late. The world he had conquered was not a world that could be owned. It was a world that chewed people up and spit them out. Frank had been a product of that world, and now he was paying the price. But as time passed, Frank began to understand something deeper, something that had eluded him during the years of his rise to power. The game was never about the money, the power, or the fear. It was about control, not just of others, but of himself. In the end, Frank's downfall had not been because he lacked control over his empire, but because he had lost control over his own desires, his own ambitions, and his own sense of self. Frank had been a man who needed to prove something to the world. He had come from nothing, and he had built everything from scratch. But in doing so, he had lost sight of what mattered most, his own integrity, his relationships, and his sense of self. The men he had trusted, the allies he had built, had all been swept away when he made the decision to cooperate with the authorities. It was a decision that shattered everything Frank had worked for, but it was also a decision that forced him to confront the very things he had been running from. In the silence of his prison cell, Frank Lucas finally began to understand the full cost of his empire. His ambition, once a driving force that had propelled him to the top, had now become his prison. The wealth, the power, the respect, none of it mattered in the end. Frank had spent his life chasing a dream, but in doing so, he had lost everything that truly mattered. And now, in the solitude of his cell, he was left with nothing but the realization that in the pursuit of greatness, he had lost his soul. The world would continue to tell the story of Frank Lucas, the man who had ruled Harlem with an iron fist, the kingpin who smuggled heroin through a war. But for Frank, the real story was one of loss. It was the story of a man who had risen to the top, only to be brought down by his own ambition. It was the story of a man who had once thought he could conquer the world, only to realize that the world had already conquered him. As Frank Lucas continued his prison sentence, the weight of his past became a constant companion, a burden he could not escape, no matter how hard he tried. The years spent in the world of drug trafficking had taught him the art of survival, but survival was a far cry from living. Now, as the days stretched into years behind bars, Frank faced the stark truth of his situation. The world he had once ruled with an iron fist was no longer a reality for him, and the power he had once wielded with ease was now a distant memory. He had been a kingpin, a master of the game, but now he was just another man in prison, trying to find his place in a world that no longer held any semblance of the power he had once known. In the beginning, Frank had been adamant about maintaining the same level of control in prison that he had in his previous life. He tried to keep the same sharp mind, the same quiet confidence, but prison was a different kind of world, one where silence could often be more dangerous than action. At first, Frank's name still carried weight. The other inmates knew who he was, and many of them respected him for his past, for the empire he had built. But as time wore on, even that respect began to fade. Respect in prison wasn't something that could be earned by reputation alone, it had to be earned through actions, through survival, through the ability to adapt to an ever-changing environment. And that was something Frank Lucas had to learn all over again. Prison, however, wasn't just about surviving the day-to-day struggles of life behind bars, it was about confronting the deep and uncomfortable truth of who Frank had become. The man who had once been untouchable was now a symbol of everything that could go wrong in the criminal world. His story was no longer one of success, but of failure, of ambition that had ultimately consumed him. Frank had never truly believed that he could be touched by the law. In his mind, he had always been one step ahead, always in control of the situation. But now, sitting in his cell, he understood just how wrong he had been. He had thought himself invincible, but in the end, he was just another man, caught in the trap of his own choices. Every day, Frank was forced to come to terms with the price of his ambition. His rise to power had been swift, and the empire he had built was impressive, but now he saw how fragile it all was. His kingdom had been built on the backs of others, on a foundation of fear, loyalty, and secrecy. But that foundation had proved to be unstable, fragile in the face of the law and the inevitable betrayals that had come. The very people he had trusted the most had been the ones to bring him down, and as Frank reflected on it, he realized how blind he had been to the dangers of his own success. The very ambition that had driven him to the top had also been the thing that led him to fall. As the years in prison dragged on, Frank found himself facing a different kind of battle, one that was less about survival and more about understanding the depths of his own mistakes. He had spent so many years building an empire, but now he had to confront the truth that what he had built had been hollow, built on lies and deception. The world of drugs and organized crime had a way of blurring the lines between right and wrong, and Frank had crossed those lines many times in the pursuit of power. He had justified his actions to himself, told himself that he was simply playing the game, but now, with nothing left to his name, he could see the consequences of his choices more clearly than ever before. But it wasn't just the betrayal of others that weighed heavily on Frank's conscience, it was his own. His decision to cooperate with the authorities had irrevocably changed the course of his life. At the time, it had seemed like the only option. He had been facing a lifetime in prison, and he had been willing to do whatever it took to avoid it. But as the years went by, Frank began to feel the weight of that decision more acutely. The very thing he had done to save himself had cost him everything. His decision to turn on his own men, to betray the loyalty that had once bound him to his empire, had destroyed not just his criminal career but also the respect he had once commanded. The quiet, calculating figure who had once walked the streets of Harlem with an air of invincibility was now reduced to a man who had been abandoned by everyone he had once trusted. His men, once loyal to the end, had turned their backs on him. His allies in the criminal world no longer wanted anything to do with him, and his reputation in the underworld was tarnished beyond repair. Frank was no longer the man who had built an empire, he was the man who had betrayed it all. His name was no longer whispered in fear or reverence, it was a name that people spoke with contempt. Despite this, Frank found solace in one thing, his story was far from over. Even in prison, Frank knew that his tale would continue to be told. The rise and fall of Frank Lucas had become the stuff of legend, a story of ambition, power, and betrayal that would continue to capture the imagination of those who heard it. But Frank understood that his legacy was not just about the criminal empire he had built, it was about the lessons that could be learned from his mistakes. He had risen to the top through sheer will, through a combination of intelligence and ruthlessness, but it had all come crashing down because he had lost sight of the very things that had made him successful in the first place. Frank had once believed that the world was his to control, but now he understood that control was an illusion. The more he tried to hold on to his empire, the more it slipped away. His ambition had driven him to the top, but it had also caused him to lose everything he had worked for. In prison, Frank began to see the reality of his situation. He was no longer the powerful figure he once was. He was no longer the feared kingpin of Harlem. He was just another inmate, serving time for the crimes he had committed. And yet, despite all that he had lost, Frank Lucas refused to be forgotten. His name may have been tarnished, his empire destroyed, but he still held on to the belief that his story was one worth telling. It was a story of ambition and failure, of power and betrayal, and of a man who had dared to dream too big. In the end, Frank knew that his legacy would be one of caution, a reminder to those who sought to build their own empires that even the greatest of men can fall. His story would serve as a warning to others, a lesson in the dangers of ambition and the price of power. Frank's time in prison became a period of reflection, of coming to terms with the man he had been and the man he had become. It was not a time of regret, but a time of understanding. He knew he could never undo the damage he had caused, but he could at least understand the forces that had shaped him, the decisions that had brought him to this point. He had been a man of power, a man who had ruled an empire, but in the end, the cost of that power had been too high. The empire had crumbled, and so had Frank Lucas. As he sat in his cell, Frank understood that his story was no longer his own. It had become a part of the greater narrative of the criminal world, a tale that would be told and retold for generations. But in the end, Frank knew that the story of his life, his rise, and his fall was a story that would never truly be forgotten. Even in the shadows of his prison cell, Frank Lucas had left a mark on the world, one that could not be erased. His name would be remembered, not for the power he had once held, but for the lessons his life had taught. The years passed, and Frank Lucas, still behind bars, found himself in a constant internal battle between pride and regret. The world outside had long moved on from his reign, but in his own mind, the events of the past played on like a haunting reel. He knew that his story had become one of myth and legend, one that would be told in whispers for decades to come. He had once commanded the heroin trade in Harlem, a kingpin whose empire stretched across the country. His name had been synonymous with power, respect, and fear. Now, in the quiet of his prison cell, Frank had come to a startling realization: none of that mattered anymore. The outside world had evolved. The streets of Harlem had changed, the people who had once bowed to him were now scattered, and the law had long since caught up with him. The men he had trusted, the men who had once stood by him, were either in prison themselves or had vanished from the game altogether. But still, Frank's mind remained sharp. His memories, though tinged with regret, were vivid and unrelenting. He could still see the faces of those who had betrayed him, the moments of victory when he had successfully outwitted his enemies, and the cold satisfaction of being untouchable. But all of it, every victory and every downfall, felt distant now. The world had moved on, and Frank was left to reconcile with the consequences of his choices. Despite the passage of time, Frank had never lost his sense of who he was. He knew that his life, no matter how it had ended, had been extraordinary. He had started with nothing, and through sheer grit, cunning, and ruthless ambition, he had built an empire that spanned borders and touched countless lives. Frank had known the streets like the back of his hand. He had learned to read people, to manipulate the environment, and to outsmart his enemies. He had ruled Harlem with an intelligence and subtlety that had set him apart from the usual criminal leaders. Frank hadn't been a man of violence, he had been a man of strategy. He had used the heroin trade as a tool, not just for profit but as a means of control. He had been patient, calculating, and above all, he had known how to stay under the radar. But the world of organized crime was fickle, and power, as Frank had learned, was never permanent. The betrayals he had suffered over the years, first from his closest allies, then from those he had trusted within the law enforcement system, had started a chain reaction that would ultimately bring him down. It was a cold irony, really. Frank had spent so much of his life building an empire based on loyalty, but in the end, loyalty had been the very thing that betrayed him. His decision to cooperate with the authorities, driven by a desperate attempt to save himself from a life sentence, had severed the last thread that connected him to his criminal world. The trust he had spent so many years cultivating had evaporated almost overnight. He had tried to play the game and win, but in the end, the price had been his soul. In prison, Frank spent his days reflecting on the cost of ambition. He thought about his rise to power, how he had started with nothing but a vision of something greater, something that would set him apart. He had always been a man of purpose, a man driven by a desire to be something more than the world had given him. Born into poverty in North Carolina, Frank had understood the harsh realities of life from an early age. He had seen the struggles of his family, the limitations that society had placed on him simply because of where he came from. But Frank was not one to accept the boundaries set by others. He was determined to carve out a life for himself that would transcend the limitations of his beginnings. And so, he moved to Harlem, a place where opportunity and danger seemed to coexist, and he built his empire from the ground up. As Frank sat in his cell, memories flooded back, memories of the early days, when he had first entered the world of organized crime. He had been drawn to the idea of power, the ability to control not just people, but circumstances. He had risen quickly, using his intellect and resourcefulness to outmaneuver his rivals. Unlike others in the game, Frank hadn't relied on violence to gain power. Instead, he had relied on strategy, patience, and above all, secrecy. He had learned to keep his movements quiet, his plans hidden. It was the kind of power that didn't need to be flaunted, the kind that stayed in the shadows, invisible but always present. But Frank also knew that the longer you stayed in the game, the more vulnerable you became. The betrayals began slowly at first, little cracks in the foundation of his empire that he ignored, believing that nothing could touch him. But eventually, the cracks spread, and the empire he had so carefully built began to unravel. The law had finally caught up with him, and Frank had made the fateful decision to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had done what he had to do to survive, but it had come at the cost of everything he had worked for. He had sold out the very people who had helped him rise to the top, and in doing so, he had destroyed the trust that had been the backbone of his success. Time in prison had given Frank the chance to reflect on the price of that betrayal. He had lost his reputation, his power, and his place in the world he had created. But more than that, he had lost his dignity. The life he had once lived, the mansions, the cars, the luxury, was now a distant memory. The man who had once been feared by both criminals and law enforcement alike was now just another prisoner, another statistic in a system that didn't care about the stories of those who found themselves behind bars. Frank had become a man without a name, without an empire, and without a future. But even in the midst of his downfall, Frank never lost his sense of self-worth. He had made mistakes, yes, but he was not a man who would let them define him. His story was not one of failure, but one of survival. Even in the darkest moments of his life, Frank knew that he had lived a life that many could only dream of. He had built an empire from the ground up, controlled a significant portion of the heroin trade, and gained the kind of power that few people ever achieved. He had risen from nothing, and though the world had knocked him down, Frank was not about to fade into obscurity. The time in prison gave Frank an unexpected gift, the chance to reflect on his life, to come to terms with the man he had been and the man he had become. He realized that while he had spent so much of his life focused on power, control, and wealth, what he had truly wanted was respect. That had been the driving force behind his actions, the desire to be seen, to be recognized as someone who was capable of achieving greatness. In the end, he had achieved greatness, but it had come at a price that he had never fully considered. As the years passed, Frank's legacy remained a topic of fascination, especially in the world of true crime. His name was still spoken in the streets of Harlem, and his story was told in books, documentaries, and films. The legend of Frank Lucas, the man who had smuggled heroin through a war, was a story that captured the imagination of many. But for Frank, the story was not as simple as the headlines made it out to be. His life had been shaped by choices, some made with a clear understanding of the consequences, others made in the heat of the moment. In the end, Frank Lucas had built an empire, but it was an empire built on shifting sand. The empire fell, and so did Frank. But the story of Frank Lucas was far from over. It would continue to be told for years to come, a tale of ambition, betrayal, and the consequences of a life lived in the shadows. And for Frank, that was a legacy he could live with. Even in the quiet of his prison cell, he knew that his story had meaning, and that it would never truly fade away. He had been a kingpin, a master of the game. He had built something extraordinary, but in the end, it was his own humanity, the very thing that had made him both powerful and vulnerable, that would shape the final chapters of his life. The years in prison had transformed Frank Lucas. The man who once ruled Harlem from the shadows, whose very presence had commanded respect, was now just another inmate in a crowded cell. Yet, the transformation wasn't just physical. In the quiet of his confinement, Frank had become introspective, almost philosophical about the choices that had defined his life. Gone was the man who saw the world as a battlefield to conquer. Instead, Frank now viewed life with a sense of painful clarity. The ambition that had driven him to the top of the heroin trade, that had fueled his rise from the depths of poverty, was now both his greatest strength and his deepest regret. Time had a peculiar way of slowing down in prison. There was no rush anymore. No more deals to strike, no more empire to expand, no more rivals to outsmart. Frank could only reflect. In those long hours of solitude, he revisited every step of his journey. The memories, once sharp and clear, had softened over the years, like an old photograph that had been touched too many times. He could still see the young man he had once been, standing at the crossroads of his life, faced with choices that would eventually carve out his destiny. Frank's world had been filled with danger, intrigue, and excitement, but now, it seemed like a lifetime ago. The speed at which he had risen and fallen was something he could barely comprehend. His empire, built on secrecy and quiet manipulation, had once been a testament to his brilliance. Frank had never been a man of brute force. He didn't need to be. His mind, his strategy, his ability to think several steps ahead, had been his weapon. The streets of Harlem had been his chessboard, and Frank had played the game with the skill of a grandmaster. He had known how to read people, how to predict movements, how to stay in control without ever showing his hand. For a time, he had been untouchable. No one had been able to infiltrate his operation. And yet, in the end, it wasn't the rivals who brought him down. It wasn't the corrupt police officers or even the threat of jail time. It was his own decisions that led to his downfall. The truth was, Frank had always been a man driven by the need for power. But power, he came to realize in the stillness of his prison cell, was a fleeting illusion. When he was at the height of his success, Frank had seen himself as invincible. He had convinced himself that he could control everything, that his empire would last forever. But now, with nothing left to his name, Frank saw how fragile everything had been. The empire he had so carefully constructed had crumbled the moment he made the decision to cooperate with law enforcement. The betrayal had been swift, and it had cost him everything. His loyalty to his men, his alliances, the respect he had earned, everything had been shattered. In trying to save himself, Frank had lost it all. But even in the face of his fall from grace, Frank didn't entirely lose his sense of self-worth. He had always been a man who believed in his own importance. The need for respect had driven much of his life, and that need hadn't disappeared, even behind bars. Frank had learned to navigate the prison system, just as he had once navigated the dangerous world of organized crime. He knew how to survive, how to maintain a certain level of authority, even in a place where his name no longer held the power it once did. Prison was a different world, one where the rules were vastly different, and where loyalty and betrayal played out in ways Frank hadn't fully anticipated. But he adapted. And yet, despite his ability to survive, Frank was forced to come to terms with the fact that his name, once feared and revered, was no longer a symbol of strength. His reputation had been destroyed, and there was nothing he could do to undo the damage. He could still walk the halls of prison with his head held high, but the reality of his situation weighed on him. He was a man who had once been larger than life, who had controlled a multi-million-dollar drug empire. Now, he was just another prisoner, another statistic in the endless flow of incarcerated men. His days of ruling were over, and he was left to reflect on what had led to his fall. In those moments of introspection, Frank couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. The life he had built was gone, and with it, so was the person he had been. He had once been a king, a leader of men. His word had been law in Harlem, and his network had stretched from the streets to the highest echelons of society. Now, none of it mattered. Frank had seen the way the world operated, had witnessed the way people moved, betrayed, and manipulated each other. He had been part of that world, but now he was outside of it, unable to change the past or reclaim the future he had lost. As the years dragged on, Frank found himself becoming more detached from the world outside. His name, once synonymous with power and fear, was now a distant memory for most people. The world had moved on without him, and there was nothing he could do to change that. The people he had known, the allies who had once worked under him, had all faded away. Some were dead, others in prison, and a few had turned on him, just as he had once turned on others. Frank had always believed in the loyalty of his men, but that loyalty had proven to be as fragile as everything else in his life. He had learned, too late, that trust in the criminal world was nothing more than an illusion. But despite the betrayal, despite the years of loss, Frank had one thing left, his story. His life, his rise to power, his fall from grace, would live on. It was a story that would be told, that would be remembered. Frank knew that much. His name would continue to be spoken of, not just in the criminal world, but in the wider culture as well. People would remember Frank Lucas, the quiet, calculating man who had taken over the heroin trade, who had outsmarted law enforcement, and who had built an empire only to watch it crumble. His name had become synonymous with both brilliance and failure, ambition and betrayal. But Frank also understood that legacy was a double-edged sword. In some ways, his name would be remembered as a cautionary tale, a warning to those who sought to follow in his footsteps. His life had been a series of choices, some made in pursuit of power, others in desperation. It was a story of a man who had risen to the top, only to be brought down by the very things that had driven him to the heights of success in the first place. His ambition, his desire for control, had ultimately been his undoing. As Frank sat in his prison cell, the years of reflection had given him a new perspective on the world. He had come to understand that power wasn't everything. He had spent his entire life chasing it, but now, in the quiet of his cell, he realized that it wasn't power that had defined him, it was the people around him, the choices he had made, and the relationships he had forged. In the end, it was the human connections that mattered, not the empire he had built. But Frank knew that it was too late for him to change that now. He had sacrificed too much to hold on to the illusion of power. Prison, ironically, had become a place of clarity for Frank. It was the one place where the noise of the world had ceased, and the only sound left was the echo of his own thoughts. In the stillness, he had come to terms with his legacy. It wasn't a story of triumph, it was a story of human frailty, of a man who had reached for the stars and had been burned by the very fire that had made him shine. And in that quiet realization, Frank found a strange kind of peace, the peace that comes with knowing that even the greatest of empires are temporary. Everything was fleeting. Power, money, respect, they could all be lost in an instant. And yet, Frank understood that his story would never truly fade. It would live on, long after he was gone, as a reminder of both the heights a man can reach and the depths to which he can fall. The years in prison began to blur together for Frank Lucas. Time, which had once seemed like a valuable commodity in the world he had built, now had little meaning. His empire was no more. The millions he had amassed were gone, seized by the authorities or squandered in the fleeting moments of his rise to power. The lavish homes, the expensive cars, the women who had come and gone, they were all distant memories now, as insubstantial as the very air he breathed. What remained in the sterile, cold confines of his cell was a man forced to confront not only his past but also the reality of what he had become. He had lived a life that many only dreamed of, but it was a life built on a foundation of secrets, manipulation, and betrayal. In the streets of Harlem, Frank had been a king. His name had commanded respect, fear, and admiration. He had been the architect of his own success, using his cunning to control the heroin trade that flowed through the veins of New York City. But that power, that empire, had come at a cost. And now, Frank Lucas was left alone in the silence of his cell, his thoughts his only company, with nothing but the consequences of his choices to keep him occupied. In the solitude of his prison cell, Frank was forced to face the reality of his decisions. The betrayals, the lies, the manipulation, he had been both the victim and the perpetrator of these actions. He had betrayed his friends, his family, and, ultimately, himself. His rise to power had been marked by calculated moves, careful manipulation, and an iron will to succeed. But in the end, those very traits, which had once served him so well, had also led to his downfall. Frank had thought himself untouchable, beyond the reach of the law and the loyalty of his men. But he had been wrong. It wasn't just the law that had brought him down, but the very people he had trusted. His loyalty had been to his own ambitions, and in the process, he had lost sight of the human connections that had once been so important. It was his need for power, for control, that had alienated him from the very people who could have helped him. In prison, Frank understood this better than ever before. The empire he had built had been built on a fragile foundation, and once it had begun to crumble, there was nothing left to hold it up. Frank's downfall had been a slow, steady unraveling, each thread of his empire coming undone one by one. His allies had turned on him, either out of fear of the authorities or out of their own selfish desire to protect themselves. Even his family, those he had once promised to protect, had been swept up in the tide of his failure. Frank had learned, too late, that power, no matter how carefully controlled, was always vulnerable. It could be taken away in an instant, and no amount of loyalty or respect could prevent it. The decision to cooperate with law enforcement had been the final nail in his coffin. At the time, it had seemed like the only option, the only way to avoid spending the rest of his life in prison. But now, as he sat in his cell, Frank could see how that decision had irrevocably altered his life. The betrayal of his men, the loss of their trust, had been a wound that could never heal. The world he had worked so hard to build had been shattered by a single choice, a choice that had seemed like survival at the time but had proven to be a self-inflicted wound. Even as he reflected on his past, Frank knew that he couldn't change what had happened. The damage was done. He could never go back to the man he had been, the man who had built an empire. All he had now were his memories, and even those had begun to fade with the passage of time. The faces of his enemies, his allies, and even his family were becoming less distinct, like photographs that had been left out in the sun too long. Frank could remember the feeling of power, the rush of success, but the details of his empire, how it had functioned, who had been involved, were beginning to blur. There were moments, however, when Frank would close his eyes and try to recall the feeling of being in control. The power he had wielded, the respect he had commanded, those had been the heights of his life. But now, as he sat in the shadows of his prison cell, those moments seemed far away, as if they belonged to someone else, someone he used to know. In some ways, Frank was no longer the same man who had once walked the streets of Harlem, who had made millions in the drug trade and outsmarted law enforcement at every turn. The years in prison had changed him, had stripped him of the trappings of success. He was no longer the man who had been untouchable. Now, he was just another prisoner, living out his days in anonymity. His name no longer inspired fear, and the empire he had built no longer mattered. The life he had lived, the decisions he had made, had led him to this moment. He had spent his life chasing power, chasing respect, but in the end, those things had only brought him misery. And now, as he sat in the quiet of his cell, he wondered if it had all been worth it. What had Frank really gained? He had built an empire, but it had been an empire of sand, fragile and easily destroyed. He had gained wealth, but it had been fleeting. The people who had once bowed to him, who had feared him, were no longer in his life. He had gained power, but it had been a hollow power, one that had come at the cost of his humanity. In the end, Frank realized that the true cost of his success had been his soul. The empire he had built had been an illusion, a house of cards that had collapsed under its own weight. And now, he was left with nothing but the memories of a life he could never reclaim. But even in his lowest moments, Frank refused to give in to despair. He had always been a survivor, a man who had never backed down from a challenge. He had risen from nothing, from the poverty of his youth, to become one of the most powerful men in the world. He had built an empire from the ground up, and that in itself was no small feat. Even though everything had crumbled around him, Frank still held on to the belief that he had accomplished something extraordinary. In those long years of reflection, Frank realized that his story was far from over. It would be told for generations to come. His name might no longer inspire fear, but it would be remembered. Frank Lucas was a man who had played the game of life at the highest stakes, a man who had risen to the top of the criminal world and had fallen just as quickly. His story would serve as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the price of ambition. It was a story that would live on, not because of the power he had once held, but because of the lessons it held for those who came after him. Frank's legacy would not be defined by the empire he built, nor by the riches he amassed. It would be defined by the choices he made, the mistakes he made, and the life he led in the shadows of his own creation. The price of ambition was high, and Frank had paid it. But in the end, he had learned the hardest lesson of all, that power was fleeting, and nothing in this world, not wealth, not respect, not even loyalty, could last forever. As Frank sat in his cell, the world outside continued to move on without him. But Frank knew that his story would not be forgotten. Even if the empire was gone, his name would live on. And perhaps, in the end, that was the only victory he would ever need. The days in prison were long, stretching out in an endless cycle of routine, each one indistinguishable from the last. For Frank Lucas, every morning was a reminder of the life he had lost, the empire he had built and then watched crumble. There was no glamour in his current existence, no high-stakes deals, no dangerous confrontations, and no money. Instead, there were gray walls, a narrow bed, and the constant hum of distant voices echoing through the corridors. He had once been a king, a man whose name commanded respect in every corner of the criminal world. Now, he was just another inmate, forgotten by most, and the weight of his fall was a constant presence in his life. But even in the drudgery of prison, Frank found a way to survive. Survival, after all, was what he had always been good at. He had built his empire not just on violence, but on strategy, on outsmarting the system, on playing the long game. And in prison, that same mentality served him well. While many others let the confinement of the prison system break them, Frank found ways to maintain a certain level of control. He knew how to navigate the system, how to earn the respect of the men around him, even if that respect was no longer earned through fear. There were still moments when Frank would sit in his cell, alone with his thoughts, and think back on the life he had lived. It was a life that had been extraordinary, a life that had been built on the foundation of ambition and ruthlessness. Frank had never been a man to shy away from what he wanted. He had built his heroin empire with precision, planning, and an iron will. From the streets of Harlem to the international drug trade, Frank had been at the top of his game, outsmarting law enforcement, rivals, and even his own men. He had controlled the flow of heroin into New York City, and in doing so, he had built an empire that had rivaled any in the history of organized crime. But the things that had made him successful, his ability to think ahead, his strategic mind, his patience, had also been the things that led to his downfall. He had trusted too many people, made deals with those who were more interested in their own survival than in loyalty, and in the end, those betrayals had cost him everything. The law had caught up with him, and the men he had trusted had turned on him. The decision to cooperate with the authorities, while a pragmatic one at the time, had sealed his fate. He had exchanged the only thing that had ever mattered to him, his loyalty, for a reduced sentence. And in doing so, he had lost the respect of the men who had once worked for him, the loyalty of the people he had considered his allies, and ultimately, his place in the world. Sitting in his cell, Frank often thought about the choices he had made, about the empire he had built and destroyed, and about the price of ambition. He had once believed that power was the ultimate goal, that control over people, over situations, over the very course of events, was the key to a meaningful life. But now, in the silence of his prison cell, Frank began to see the truth. Power was fleeting, and the cost of power was steep. It was a lesson that had been taught to him over the years, first by the betrayals he had suffered at the hands of his own men, and later by the collapse of his empire.